I think qualitatively different from previous American economic crises. Because it's not just structural problems within the United States, it's the fact that other countries have basically embraced the capitalist model and are competing with us on our own terms. So that makes it a lot harder. It's not like fighting against the Soviet Union, if you know what I'm saying. So we're not only faced with our own problems here, we're faced with countries like China and Brazil and India that are very hungry. So usually in the past, America has embraced minorities or opened up to them because the economic pie kept getting bigger, and that makes it easier. People forget that the 60s, the civil rights movement, was also a time of pretty insane wealth by standards of today. Minimum wage in 1968, I believe, in current dollars is about $13 an hour. Just to kind of put that into contrast for you, right? Like, think about that for a second, right? You're all being ripped off. But, you know, that makes it a lot harder. So I think for American Muslims, this is a big problem. Because when there's a lot of economic anxiety, it amplifies all these problems. That said, you know, I think that most of this is going to pass, just because it's not really sustainable. And the reason I would say that is because it's not any sort of specific love for American Muslims. It's the fact that a lot of other populations have gone through a lot of things, and they're not going to let Muslims go down because they could be next. So women, Latinos, African Americans, gays and lesbians, the Jewish population, right? Like, all these groups have gone through a lot to get space for themselves in American society. And if they see another minority being picked on, in the back of their minds, they're going to think, without a doubt, I mean, any minority is going to think this, or anyone who feels himself vulnerable is going to think, what if I'm next? And the best example of that was the Peter King hearings, where one of the Latina congresswomen from California, you know, sort of incredulously engaged with one of the Muslim witnesses, you know, sort of star witnesses on the panel, and said, you know, I would strongly recommend that if you ever talk to the FBI, you should have a lawyer present, right? She wasn't talking out of any special sympathy for Muslims. She was talking as a Hispanic woman who was like, you know, you need to have someone there to watch your back because you've been on the receiving end of law enforcement. So I think that in general the future is actually is not too bad. I think that it's just easy for a minority population to get overwhelmed by the immediate and think that it has lasted forever. There's a question over there. Arslan is trying to leave. He was like almost out the door, and I stopped my question just in time. Hey, where's the guy who took the ginger ale?
Right. My question is about fiqh. Do you think fiqh should be revised and reformed for Muslims in America? And that question, I also had another one regarding Libya. Do you think that Libya is going to be partitioned into a two-state? I mean, with, you know, pro-government Gaddafi forces on one side and rebel forces on the other?
That's a good question. So for those of you who don't know, I'll give you like a 2-second introduction to what is Sharia law, the greatest danger to Western civilization ever, while fixing my tie, because I'm cool. Sharia is, in Islam, the totality of God's revelation to humanity, and is essentially how God tells a human being to attain salvation, peace in this life and peace in the next life. Fiqh, the F-I-Q-H, is literally an attempt to understand Sharia. So Sharia is perfect and unchanging, but it is in a sense inaccessible. All human beings can do, in the absence of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is attempt to develop their best possible understanding of what it means to live according to God's guidance in the present condition. Right? So that is an interpretation. I would say, in terms of your question, 2 things. The first is that we don't have enough institutions in the United States to train people who understand the situation here. And so the question of revising, reforming, I think is not necessarily the question. The question is, we need people in larger numbers who are able to speak to religious and ethical challenges, who understand what it means to be an American. You know, and beyond that, also engage in American society and understand the give and take and the difficulties and the challenges, you know. The second thing is that I think is that as we develop institutions, we will learn that there are a lot more answers in our tradition than we think there are. So for example, how many of you know if you can pray, like we prayed up here, on a plane? Can you pray on a plane? Anyone? Yes, why? You can. Yes, that is called a tautology. Yes? You have the freedom to do that. Woo, freedom! No, buzzword. What's up? You wouldn't comment on the wisdom. So, I'm not a scholar of Islamic law, so I'm not going to get into any of that because I'm not by any means qualified to do that. But here's an interesting case. A fatwa, here's another 5-letter buzzword, is what happens when someone asks a religious expert for their opinion on something. And it's not binding. It's just this guy's opinion or this woman's opinion. This is my situation. What do you think I should do? Many times, it's the equivalent of asking for an expert opinion. That's literally it. So in a court, when an attorney or a judge asks for an expert opinion, that's a fatwa. That's it. So a guy in Spain, Muslim Spain, asks a scholar, can I pray on a magic carpet? I'm not even kidding. This is like an actual case. After Hosni Mubarak sent people in on camels, we can just indulge every stereotype in the world. Next, I'm going to talk about Aladdin and Jasmine. And Prince Ali. What was up with that, right? It was India, Baghdad, it was very confusing. And the really short, embarrassingly fat man was Haroon al-Rashid, the caliph named after me. So it really kind of brings you down, right? So basically, this guy asks this scholar, can I pray on a magic carpet? And the scholar's answer is yes, and here's why. He devises a series of experiments to determine if air has mass. Because if air, the atmosphere, has mass, then it is qualitatively the same as dirt or the ground, and you can pray on it. Because we are allowed to pray on the earth. So rather than interpret earth literally as dirt, he interprets earth as that which has mass. And so if you are on the air affects bodies around it, right? In the same way that something with mass does, just like water, therefore you can pray on it. The point being here is, we can pray on planes, we kind of know that, right? But the point is that there are all these things in Muslim tradition that are just amazingly deep and profound, but the last few hundred years have seen such a decline in resources that people don't even know the kind of questions and the range of scholarship that was engaged. And so we have this very starved sense of what Muslim scholarship was capable of, and that, I think, leaves us all the poorer for it. So I don't know if that gets your question. As to Libya, can I perhaps hold off on that? So if there are any other questions on, something more direct, and if we want to get into Libya, we can, get into Libya. But remind me if I forget. Nobody has any other questions. It's 7. Oh, there's a question.
Hi, I'd really like to know some sources that everything was said in this presentation. So I actually want to study these things later on. So
you want sources on what I covered?
Yeah, pretty much some part of these things.
There's a really good book by Edward Curtis, a professor in Indiana, called Muslims in America, which is a really good overview. That covers African American Islam from very early on to the present. This guy in Weed College, who has the very awkward last name of Ghania Basiri, he has a long book on Islam in America, which is a really, really good collection. And I'm trying to think of one other thing. Sylviane Diouf, Senegalese woman, wrote a book called Prince Among Slaves, which is a really good history of Islam in America in the 1700s and 1800s. So those would be, I think, good.
Thank you.
Someone in the front, is there anyone here? Yeah? Or no? I guess not. You guys are just not asking questions. This is the smarter side of it. I'm just kidding. That was messed up.
I had a question about where the Islamic parties would fit in the new democratic order in the Middle East now. I don't know, which way do you think it would trend? More secular or more, I don't know, Iranian or Saudi types?
Okay, so that kind of connects to the Libya question. Did everyone hear the question? No? He was asking about where Islamic parties would fit in the Middle East, and whether the revolutions will trend more secular or more religious, I guess. I think that it's very important to remember this one kind of weird fact. The word secular didn't exist when our Constitution was written. The concept of secularism as a doctrine didn't exist. We had separation of church and state, obviously, right, in the First Amendment, but the idea of secular didn't exist. And this is important for a reason, because in many Muslim countries, secularism didn't develop as an organic process. It was imposed from within or from outside. So it was not a matter of secularity versus religion, it was just dictatorship. And in some cases like Iran and Saudi Arabia, you have religious dictatorship. And in places like Tunisia and Algeria and Turkey, you had a secular dictatorship. I think based on what I'm seeing right now, the Muslim world is evolving kind of a fourth form of democracy. And again, it's very nebulous, so by no means can I argue that this is like set in stone. But there is the American democratic tradition, which incorporates religiosity, not politically but culturally. There is a European tradition, which is a very strong antipathy to religion in some form, right? And there is the Indian tradition, and Indian secularism is basically, instead of keeping all religions equally distant, you keep all religions equally close. Right? So India's secularism is a very religious form of secularism, right? So in India, you get every possible holiday off from school. So that's one way of understanding kind of the difference, right? Because every religious group that's recognized becomes part of the system. In the Muslim world, I think what's happening is that most of the parties on the ground have realized that there is no way to impose their view on the other, and they will never get out of a cycle of violence or dictatorship unless they have some sort of sharing of power. What that means is you will have something which is kind of hard to pin down because it doesn't exist in the world right now, really. You will have explicitly religious parties along with explicitly secular parties attempting to hash out political compromises and build political systems out of their compromises. I know that seems like a weird answer, but that's, I think, what's going to happen. You're going to have parties like the Muslim Brotherhood which advocate for a religious political order in some form, and you will have communist parties. And they all recognize right now, at least right now, that they have to sit at the same table. And if they allow themselves to be divided, they will be played off of each other by someone like Mubarak. You know what I mean? So everyone will kind of have to come to the table and work out some kind of, middle ground. And what this means is weird, because it means that you will have a hybrid secular religious state. And what that looks like, I don't know. It could be a matter of determining, is there a dress code? And there may be like partial dress code. You know what I mean? Like rather than an imposition like in Turkey where if you wore a turban you could be executed, or Iran where if you don't cover your hair you could be put in jail, you may have some sort of middle ground. Does that make sense? And I think you'll see this in economics and politics. And it'll be a constant negotiation. It won't be this grand narrative where you have this sort of Enlightenment tradition of politics and it's like, yeah, like this is our system and we're going with it. It's kind of like we're all at the table and we have to figure something out, and we're going to figure something out. In terms of Libya, I actually think U.S. involvement was a bad idea. That's a longer debate, I guess, but I think it's very complicated right now because the rebels aren't strong enough to defeat Darth Vader, aka Gaddafi, and they are rebels in the desert, so get it. It's like, I'm about to bring out my Star Wars presentation. It's just so, Arsalan saw it, it's so cool. But the point being that it's a very awkward situation because once the U.S. intervened, we are now fully responsible for the civilian population of eastern Libya. And if the rebels can't hold off Gaddafi, which they can't, without assistance, then either we have to escalate the airstrikes, in which case you would savage Libya's infrastructure, to no clear end, or you arm the rebels, which is an awkward proposition, or you land troops, whether as peacekeepers or to kill Gaddafi. If you land peacekeepers, where do the peacekeepers come from? Who maintains them and how long do they stay, and what happens to Libya? It would be de facto partition. You would have two countries. One would be an international pariah, and one would be a very shaky, awkward state with international support and some oil revenue, but no clear long-term trajectory. If you try to invade and conquer Libya, that's a much messier proposition. So I really don't know. And the thing that's kind of unfortunate about it is that the two newest Arab democracies are on both sides of Libya. So the longer Libya remains unstable, the worse it is for Egypt and the worse it is for Tunisia. And that goes back to Timur's question, actually, because the trajectory of Egypt will also depend on what happens in Libya. Because if Libya fragments and you get refugees coming across the border, you'll probably see the military crack down. Because at that point,